The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lincoln High School's gymnasium, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Today wasn't just any ordinary Saturday. The building buzzed with an energy that made your skin tingle. Families filled the bleachers, their excited chatter mixing with the sound of sneakers squeaking on the court. Kids ran around with wide eyes pointing at the competitors warming up. Parents clutched programs and cameras, ready to capture every moment of their children's big day. This was the annual Southern California Youth Martial Arts Championship, and everyone knew it was a big deal. Winners from this tournament would go on to compete at the state level. For many young fighters, this was their shot at something bigger than weekend classes at the local dojo. The smell of athletic tape and that familiar gymnasium scent filled the air. Volunteers in bright yellow shirts directed traffic, helping families find seats and answering questions about the schedule. A concession stand in the corner sold hot dogs and sodas, with a long line of hungry spectators waiting their turn. Ante. One side of the gym, competitors stretched and practiced their forms. Some looked confident, throwing precise kicks and punches with the focus of seasoned athletes. Others appeared nervous, constantly checking their belts and adjusting their uniforms. Parents offered last-minute encouragement and reminders about technique. In the middle of all this activity sat a man who seemed completely out of place. While everyone around him talked loudly and moved with excitement, he remained perfectly still. He wore simple jeans and a plain shirt, nothing fancy or attention-grabbing. His mustache was neatly trimmed, and his hair was combed in a way that suggested he came from a different era. Most people would have walked right past him without a second glance. But there was something about the way he watched everything. His eyes followed the young martial artists as they warmed up, studying their movements with the attention of someone who truly understood what he was seeing. When a young girl executed a perfect spinning kick, the corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile. When another competitor stumbled through a basic form, he nodded with understanding rather than judgment. Near the competition area, 17-year-old Tommy Rodriguez adjusted his white belt for the 10th time in 5 minutes. His hands shook slightly as he tried to focus on his breathing exercises. This was his first major tournament, and the butterflies in his stomach felt more like eagles. He had been training for 3 years at his neighborhood dojo, dreaming of this moment. Tommy's parents sat in the third row, his mother clutching a small camera and his father holding a program so tightly it was starting to wrinkle. They had saved money for months to pay for Tommy's training and tournament entry fees. This wasn't just Tommy's dream. It was the whole family's hope for something better. The teenager's instructor, Mr. Kim, approached with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Remember what we practiced," he said in his calm voice. "Stay relaxed. Trust your training and show respect to your opponent no matter what happens." Tommy nodded, trying to absorb the wisdom while dealing with his racing heartbeat. He looked across the mat at his opponent and felt his stomach drop. Derek Martinez stood on the other side, rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles. Where Tommy appeared nervous and respectful, Derek looked like he was getting ready for a street fight rather than a martial arts competition. Derek had a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Other competitors whispered about his matches, how he seemed to enjoy hurting people a little too much. He followed the rules technically, but everyone knew he pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in controlled contact competition. Tournament director Mrs. Patterson had actually received 3 separate complaints about Derek's behavior in previous competitions. Parents had called asking why someone so aggressive was allowed to continue competing. But Derek's instructor always defended him, claiming he was just intense and competitive. "He's never actually broken any specific rules," Derek's sensei would say when confronted. Sometimes martial arts looks rough to people who don't understand it. The truth was more complicated. Derek did stay within the technical rules, but he brought an attitude to competition that made everyone uncomfortable. He celebrated victories too enthusiastically, showed no concern when opponents got hurt, and seemed to view martial arts as a way to dominate rather than grow. As the opening ceremony began, all the competitors lined up in neat rows facing the judges' table. The head judge, an elderly man with decades of martial arts experience, stepped forward to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our annual championship, he announced through the microphone. Today we celebrate not just athletic ability, but the values that make martial arts special. Discipline, respect, perseverance, and humility. The crowd applauded politely, but you could feel the excitement building. Everyone was ready for the action to begin. I want to remind all our competitors, the judge continued, that winning isn't everything. How you win or lose shows who you really are. Martial arts teaches us to be strong enough to protect others, not to hurt them. Tommy listened to every word, nodding along with the speech. These were the same values Mr. Kim had been teaching him since day one. Martial arts wasn't about fighting. It was about becoming a better person. Derek, on the other hand, seemed barely interested in the opening remarks. He looked around the gym, sizing up potential opponents and probably planning his victory. Celebrations. The quiet man in the bleachers continued watching everything with that same careful attention. When the judge spoke about respect and humility, he nodded slightly, as if remembering similar words from his own martial arts journey decades earlier. As the ceremony concluded and competitors began preparing for their first matches, the energy in the room shifted. The friendly pre-tournament atmosphere gave way to focused intensity. Parents gripped their seats tighter. Competitors went through final warm-up routines. Coaches offered last-minute strategic advice. Tommy's match was scheduled. For the second round, he had about 30 minutes to continue preparing, which felt like both too much and too little time. His parents caught his eye from the stands and gave him encouraging thumbs up. His mother mouthed, "We love you," while his father held up a small sign with Tommy's name written in colorful markers. The first few matches went smoothly. Competitors showed good sportsmanship, judges made fair calls, and parents cheered appropriately. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned for a successful tournament. But experienced martial artists in attendance, including the quiet observer in the simple clothes, knew that tournaments could change quickly. One bad match, one competitor with poor attitude, one moment of lost control could shift the entire atmosphere. As Tommy's name was called for his match, the teenager took a deep breath and walked toward the competition area. His heart pounded, but he felt ready. 3 years of training had prepared him for this moment. What he didn't know was that the next few minutes would change not just his tournament experience, but his entire understanding of what martial arts really meant. And sitting quietly in the stands, a legendary figure was about to witness something that would force him to act in a way no one expected. The referee called both fighters to the center of the mat. Tommy walked forward with measured steps, his white uniform crisp and clean, his belt tied perfectly. He bowed respectfully to the judges, then turned to face his opponent. Derek strutted, to his position like he owned the place, his bow so quick it barely counted as one. "Touch gloves and return to your corners," the referee instructed. Tommy extended his gloved hand with genuine respect, looking Derek in the eye. But Derek just slapped Tommy's hand away dismissively and smirked. A few people in the crowd noticed this small act of disrespect, and whispers started spreading through the bleachers. The quiet man in jeans shifted slightly in his seat, his trained eyes catching every detail of what was happening below. "Fighters, ready?" the referee asked, raising his hand. "Begin." Tommy immediately took his fighting stance, the same one he had practiced thousands of times in Mr. Kim's dojo. His feet were positioned perfectly, his hands up in a defensive guard, his breathing controlled. He had spent countless hours learning to stay calm under pressure. Derek bounced on his toes like a boxer, his movements aggressive and intimidating. Where Tommy looked like a martial artist, Derek looked like someone looking for a street fight. The first exchange happened fast. Tommy threw a controlled front kick, aiming for Derek's chest area, exactly the kind of technique that scored points in controlled contact competition. It was clean, precise, and demonstrated good form. Derek didn't even try to counter with technique. Instead, he caught Tommy's leg and threw him backward with unnecessary force. Tommy hit the mat harder than he should have, but quickly rolled back to his feet. The crowd murmured with concern, but technically, nothing illegal had happened. Tommy's father leaned forward in his seat. "That seemed a bit rough," he whispered to his wife, who was gripping her camera so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The match continued, but something felt wrong. Every time Tommy tried to demonstrate proper martial arts technique, Derek responded with brute force. When Tommy attempted a respectful sparring exchange, Derek turned it into something that looked more like a brawl. Tommy threw a perfectly executed reverse punch, pulling it back at the last second to maintain the light. Contact rules. Derek, instead of acknowledging the clean technique, stepped forward and drove his elbow toward Tommy's ribs with full force. The referee stepped in quickly. "Watch the contact level," he warned Derek. Derek just shrugged and nodded, but his eyes told a different story. He was enjoying this way too much. Mr. Kim called out from the sideline, "Stay calm, Tommy. Stick to your training." But staying calm was getting harder by the second. Tommy could feel that this wasn't normal competition. Derek wasn't trying to win through skill. He was trying to hurt someone. The next exchange made everything clear. Tommy attempted a spinning back kick, a move he had practiced hundreds of times. It was supposed to be a demonstration of balance, timing, and control. As he spun, Derek stepped in close and drove his knee upward, catching Tommy in the ribs. The sound echoed through the gymnasium. Tommy doubled over, gasping for air. The crowd went silent for a moment, then erupted in concerned voices. "That's too much contact," someone shouted from the bleachers. The referee stopped the action again. "Final warning about excessive contact," he told Derek sternly. Derek held up his hands innocently. "Sorry, ref." He spun into me. "Accidents happen in martial arts, right? But it wasn't an accident, and everyone watching knew it." Derek's instructor nodded approvingly from the corner, apparently thinking this aggressive approach was working perfectly. Tommy straightened up slowly, still trying to catch his breath. His ribs ached, but he wasn't going to quit. 3 years of training had taught him that martial arts was about perseverance as much as technique. The quiet observer in the stands sat forward slightly, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. As the match resumed, Derek's true nature became impossible to hide. He threw a punch that was supposed to stop short of contact, but instead connected solidly with Tommy's shoulder. When Tommy stumbled backward, Derek followed up with a sweep that sent the teenager crashing to the mat again. Tommy's mother started to stand up, but her husband gently pulled her back down. "Let him handle it," he whispered, though his own voice was tight with worry. The pattern continued for another minute. Tommy would attempt proper martial arts technique, and Derek would respond with something that belonged in a street fight rather than a tournament. The referee seemed unsure how to handle the situation. Derek was technically following the rules, but everyone could see he was crossing moral lines. Then came the moment that changed everything. Tommy, bruised but determined, decided to try a defensive strategy. When Derek charged forward with another overly aggressive attack, Tommy attempted to redirect the energy using a technique Mr. Kim had taught him. It was an advanced move that required timing and trust between sparring partners. Tommy grabbed Derek's extended arm and tried to guide him past in a controlled throw. In a normal match between respectful competitors, Derek would have allowed himself to be thrown safely, understanding that Tommy had executed the technique correctly. Instead, Derek saw an opportunity. As Tommy began the throwing motion, Derek deliberately twisted his body in a way that put tremendous pressure on Tommy's extended arm. Then, with a vicious smile, Derek grabbed Tommy's wrist with both hands and wrenched it backward with all his strength. The sound that followed was something no one in that gymnasium would ever forget. The sharp crack of bone breaking cut through all the other noise like a gunshot. For a split second, the entire room went completely silent. Then Tommy screamed. It wasn't the kind of yell you might hear from someone who got hit too hard during sparring. This was the sound of someone in real serious pain. Tommy collapsed to the mat, clutching his arm and crying out as waves of agony washed over him. Derek didn't let go immediately. For several long seconds, he held the broken arm in position, looking down at Tommy with satisfaction. Only when the referee physically pushed him away did Derek finally release his grip. "My arm!" Tommy gasped between sobs. "I think it's broken." His parents were already rushing down from the bleachers along with several other adults. Tommy's mother reached the mat first, dropping to her knees beside her son. "Don't move, honey," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to stay calm. "Help is coming." But Derek wasn't finished. Instead of showing concern or apologizing, he stood over Tommy's writhing form and raised his arms in victory. He actually celebrated, as if breaking another teenager's arm was something to be proud of. "That's how you finish a fight," Derek shouted to his corner, where his instructor was nodding approvingly. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Parents started booing. Other competitors looked shocked and disgusted. Tournament officials huddled together, trying to figure out how to handle a situation none of them had ever encountered before. But in the middle of all this chaos, one person remained perfectly still. The quiet man in the simple clothes stood slowly from his seat, his face set with a determination that made the air around him feel different. Several people nearby noticed him standing, though they couldn't quite place where they'd seen that face before. All they knew was that something had shifted in the room, and it had nothing to do with the injured teenager on the mat. The gymnasium erupted into chaos. What had been a family-friendly martial arts tournament just seconds earlier now felt like the scene of a serious accident. Parents who had been cheering moments before now sat in stunned silence, many covering their children's eyes or turning their heads away from the disturbing scene on the mat. Tommy lay curled on his side, his broken arm cradled against his chest. His face had gone pale and beads of sweat dotted his forehead as he tried to deal with the overwhelming pain. The sound he was making wasn't quite crying. It was deeper than that, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere beyond normal. "Hurt. Someone call 911, shouted Mrs. Patterson, the tournament director, as she rushed toward the mat. Her hands shook as she pulled out her cell phone, fumbling with the numbers. Tommy's mother knelt beside her son, whispering reassuring words, while trying not to let her own panic show. "It's going to be okay, baby. The ambulance is coming. Just breathe with me, okay?" His father stood nearby, his fists clenched so tightly his arms were trembling. He kept looking back and forth between his injured son and Derek, who was still celebrating like he'd just won the Olympics. The crowd's initial shock was quickly turning into anger. Voices rose from different sections of the bleachers as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. "That wasn't martial arts," called out one father. "That was assault." "How is that kid still allowed to compete?" demanded a mother, pointing at Derek. "Where are the tournament officials? Why isn't anyone doing anything?" An elderly man who had been watching martial arts competitions for decades shook his head in disgust. "I've never seen anything like this in 40 years of tournaments. This isn't what we teach our children." Several young competitors who had been warming up for their own matches stopped what they were doing. Some looked frightened, suddenly unsure if they wanted to step onto that same mat. Others appeared angry, understanding that Derek's behavior was making all martial artists look bad. But Derek seemed completely oblivious to the crowd's reaction. If anything, the negative attention was energizing him. He walked in a small circle around the mat, still holding his arms up in victory, soaking up what he apparently thought was admiration. "Did you see that takedown?" he called out to his instructor. "That's how you dominate an opponent." His instructor, a thin man with a goatee, nodded approvingly from the corner. "Beautiful work, Derek. You showed him who's boss." This exchange made the crowd even more upset. Parents began standing up, some shouting directly at Derek's corner. "That boy needs help," yelled one mother. "Not encouragement." "What kind of teacher celebrates hurting children?" demanded another voice. The tournament officials huddled together near the judges' table, speaking in urgent whispers. They were clearly out of their depth. Most martial arts competitions never dealt with anything worse than minor bumps and bruises. None of them had protocols for handling what looked like a deliberate injury. "Technically, he didn't break any specific rules," one judge said quietly. "Are you serious?" replied Mrs. Patterson. "Look at that boy's arm. Rules or no rules, this has gone way too far. But if we disqualify Derek now, his instructor will probably file a complaint with the state organization. They'll say we changed the rules mid-tournament." "I don't care about complaints," Mrs. Patterson shot back. "We have a responsibility to protect these kids." Meanwhile, paramedics had arrived and were carefully examining Tommy's arm. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, spoke gently to the teenager while her partner prepared a stretcher. "Can you tell me your name, son?" she asked. "Tommy," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "Tommy Rodriguez." "Okay, Tommy, we're going to take good care of you. This is going to hurt for a little while longer, but we'll get you to the hospital and fix you right up." As the paramedics worked, Tommy's parents answered questions about insurance and medical history. His mother kept one hand on her son's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Tommy was carefully moved onto the stretcher. Several people were crying now, including some of the other young competitors. This was supposed to be a celebration of martial arts, not a medical emergency. But as the paramedics prepared to wheel Tommy toward the exit, Derek did something that shocked everyone even more. He walked over to the stretcher and looked down at the injured teenager. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before stepping into the ring with someone serious," Derek said with a cold smile. "This is what real martial arts looks like." Tommy's father had heard enough. He stepped toward Derek, his face red with anger. "You stay away from my son." For a moment, it looked like there might be another fight. Several men from the crowd started moving toward the mat, and Derek's instructor stepped forward defensively. The situation was spiraling out of control. That's when something changed in the atmosphere of the room. Near the back of the gym, the quiet man in simple clothes had stood up from his seat. He wasn't moving toward the chaos around the mat, but somehow his presence seemed to command attention. A few people nearby noticed him first, turning to look at this ordinary-seeming person who suddenly felt anything but ordinary. "Wait a minute," whispered a woman sitting 2 rows behind him. "I know that face." "Is that—" began her husband, squinting to get a better look. More heads started turning. People began pointing discreetly and whispering to each other. The recognition spread, slowly through the crowd like ripples in a pond. "Oh my God," breathed a teenage boy who had been watching the tournament with his grandfather. "That's Chuck Norris." The name spread through the bleachers faster than wildfire. Parents grabbed their children's arms and pointed. Competitors stopped what they were doing and stared. Even some of the tournament officials looked over to see what was causing the new commotion. Chuck Norris stood quietly in the middle of the growing recognition, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on what was happening around the mat. His expression was calm but intense, like someone making an important decision. Derek, still basking in his twisted victory, was completely unaware that a legend was watching him. He continued trash-talking and celebrating, even as Tommy was wheeled past him toward the exit. "That's what happens when you're not ready for the big leagues," Derek called out, making sure everyone could hear him. Some of the younger kids in the crowd looked scared now. If this was what martial arts competition was really like, maybe they didn't want any part of it. Parents were already talking about pulling their children from future tournaments. But the older martial artists in attendance, the ones who had trained for years and understood what the discipline was really about, felt something different. They felt shame that someone like Derek was representing their sport. They felt angry that a young man like Tommy had been hurt by someone who clearly didn't understand the first thing about martial arts philosophy. And they felt hopeful when they realized that Chuck Norris was in the building. Because if anyone could set things right, if anyone could show Derek and his instructor what martial arts really meant, it would be the man who had spent decades not just mastering the physical techniques, but understanding the deeper meaning behind them. Chuck took a step forward, and the crowd parted naturally to make room for him. His movement was unhurried but purposeful, like someone who had made up his mind about something important. Derek was still celebrating his victory, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. The whispers grew louder as Chuck Norris made his way down from the bleachers. People moved aside without being asked, creating a natural path for the legendary martial artist. His steps were measured and calm, but everyone could sense the quiet authority in his movement. Derek was still soaking up what he thought was his moment of glory, flexing his muscles and showing off to the few supporters he had in the crowd. His instructor patted him on the back, apparently proud of the destruction his student had just caused. "That's how we do it," Derek's sensei called out. "No mercy in competition." But the celebration was about to come to an abrupt end. Chuck reached the edge of the competition mat and stopped. He didn't rush forward or make a big scene. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, watching Derek with those calm, steady eyes that had seen everything in decades of martial arts training and Hollywood. Action scenes. The crowd began to quiet down as more people noticed what was happening. Parents stopped their angry conversations. Other competitors paused their warm-ups. Even the tournament officials stopped their confused discussions to see what was unfolding. Derek finally sensed that something had changed in the room. He turned around expecting to see more admiration for his victory, but instead found himself face to face with a middle-aged man in plain clothes who was looking at him with an expression that made Derek's stomach suddenly feel tight. "Excuse me," Chuck said in a voice that was quiet but carried easily across the gymnasium. "I'd like to have a word with you." Derek looked confused. Who was this random guy who thought he could just walk up and interrupt his celebration? "Do I know you?" Derek asked with his usual arrogance. A ripple of disbelief went through the crowd. Someone actually didn't recognize Chuck Norris. "My name is Chuck," came the simple reply. "Chuck Norris." The color drained from Derek's face as the recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mouth fell open slightly, and for the first time all day, he seemed at a loss for words. Derek's instructor stepped forward quickly, suddenly realizing that his student had just seriously messed up. "Mr. Norris, what an honor." Derek was just showing good competitive spirit. "You understand how it is in martial arts, right?" Chuck turned his attention to the instructor, and his gaze was even more intense than before. "No, I don't think I do understand. Could you explain to me what I just watched?" The instructor started sweating despite the cool air in the gymnasium. "Well, sometimes these things happen in competition. Derek won fair and square. The other kid just wasn't ready for serious martial arts." Chuck nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. Then he looked back at Derek, who was still standing frozen in place. "Son, how long have you been studying martial arts?" Chuck asked. 5 years, Derek managed to stammer. 5 years. And in those 5 years, what would you say is the most important thing you've learned?" Derek glanced at his instructor, looking for help with the answer. His sensei nodded encouragingly, apparently thinking this was a chance to impress the famous martial artist. "To dominate my opponents," Derek said, trying to regain some of his earlier confidence. "To never show weakness. To win at any cost." The gymnasium fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the wooden floor. Chuck studied Derek's face for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that surprised everyone listening. "Son, in 5 years of training, nobody taught you what martial arts is really about." Derek looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Chuck said, taking a step closer, "that what I just watched wasn't martial arts. That was a young man using his physical training to hurt someone weaker than himself. That's the exact opposite of what martial arts teaches." Derek's instructor tried to interrupt. "Now wait just a minute." Chuck held up one hand, and the man immediately went quiet. There was something about Chuck's presence that commanded respect, without him having to raise his voice or make threats. "I've been studying martial arts for over 50 years, Chuck continued, speaking directly to Derek. "I've trained with some of the greatest masters who ever lived, and every single one of them taught me the same basic principle. True strength is used to protect people, not to hurt them." Derek shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance starting to crumble. "But I won the match. I followed the rules." "Did you?" Chuck asked. "Let me ask you something. When you grabbed that young man's arm, what was going through your mind?" Derek hesitated, realizing this was a trap but not sure how to avoid it. "I was trying to win," he said finally. "No," Chuck replied firmly. "You were trying to hurt someone. There's a big difference between winning a martial arts competition and deliberately injuring another human being." The crowd watched this exchange in fascination. Here was one of the most famous martial artists in the world, calmly explaining basic principles to someone who clearly had never learned them. Chuck turned to address Derek's instructor. "And you encourage this behavior?" The instructor squirmed under Chuck's steady gaze. "Competition is tough, Mr. Norris. Sometimes you have to be aggressive to win." "Aggressive and violent aren't the same thing," Chuck replied. "Martial arts teaches controlled aggression. The ability to be fierce when necessary, but always with discipline and respect for your opponent. He looked back at Derek. That young man you just hurt. He showed you respect before the match. He followed. Proper etiquette, he tried to compete with honor. And your response was to break his arm and then celebrate about it. Derek was starting to look smaller by the second. The confident bully from minutes earlier was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand just how badly he had messed up. I was just competing hard, Derek said weakly. No, Chuck said with quiet firmness. You were being a bully, and bullies who hide behind martial arts training are the worst kind of bullies because they're using something beautiful and turning it into something ugly. The words hit Derek like physical blows. For the first time, he seemed to really understand what he had done. Chuck took another step forward, and Derek instinctively stepped back. Not because Chuck was threatening him, but because Derek could feel the weight of genuine authority, the kind that comes from decades of discipline, training, and wisdom. Son, let me ask you something else, Chuck said. Are you proud of what you just did? Derek opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. For the first time all day, he actually thought about the question instead of just reacting. He started, then stopped. Take your time, Chuck said patiently. It's an important question. Derek looked around the gymnasium. He saw the angry faces in the crowd. He saw other young martial artists looking at him with disgust. He saw tournament officials shaking their heads in disappointment. And for the first time, he saw his actions through other people's eyes. No, he said quietly. I'm not proud of it. Chuck nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said today. Now what do you think you should do about it? Derek looked confused again. What do you mean? I mean, Chuck said, that actions have consequences. You hurt someone today, what are you going to do to make that right? Derek stood there in silence, wrestling with Chuck's question about making things right. The gymnasium waited. Hundreds of eyes focused on this young man who was clearly having the most important moment of his life. I don't know, Derek finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Nobody ever asked me that before. Chuck studied Derek's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus just fear of getting in trouble. What he saw was a confused young man who was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about martial arts was wrong. Let me help you figure it out, Chuck said. But first I want to show you something. You think you're a tough fighter, right? Derek nodded, hesitantly, not sure where this was going. Good. Then you won't mind demonstrating your technique on someone who can actually defend himself. The crowd murmured with excitement. Was Chuck Norris about to challenge this kid to a fight? Derek's instructor stepped forward quickly. Now, Mr. Norris, there's no need for that. Derek has already proven himself today. Chuck turned to the instructor with a look that could have frozen water. Has he? Because from where I'm standing, all he's proven is that he can hurt someone who wasn't trying to hurt him back. That doesn't make him tough. That makes him a coward. The words hit Derek like a slap. He had spent years thinking of himself as a warrior, a fighter, someone to be feared and respected. But Chuck was right. He had never actually faced someone who could fight back properly. I'm not a coward, Derek said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then prove it, Chuck replied calmly. Show me those techniques you used on Tommy, but this time, use them on someone your own size. Derek looked around nervously. His instructor was shaking his head, clearly wanting to get out of this situation as quickly as possible. But the crowd was watching, and Derek's pride wouldn't let him back down in front of all these people. Fine, Derek said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But don't blame me if you get hurt. A few people in the crowd actually laughed at this. Derek threatening Chuck Norris was like a house cat threatening a lion. Chuck stepped onto the mat, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Even in jeans and a simple shirt, he looked like what he was. A master martial artist who had nothing to prove but was about to prove something anyway. Same rules as your last match, Chuck said. Show me what you've got. Derek took his fighting stance, but something was different now. Against Tommy, he had been confident and aggressive. Against Chuck, he looked nervous and uncertain. The two Fighters circled each other for a moment. Derek threw a tentative punch, the same kind of aggressive strike he had used to overwhelm Tommy. Chuck simply stepped aside, making Derek's attack look clumsy and predictable. Derek tried again, this time with a kick that had knocked Tommy off balance earlier. Chuck caught Derek's leg effortlessly and held it there, demonstrating complete control over the situation. "Is this your best technique?" Chuck asked calmly, still holding Derek's leg. "Because this is what you used to hurt that young man." Derek tried to pull his leg free, but Chuck's grip was like iron. Panic started to set in as Derek realized he was completely outmatched. Chuck released Derek's leg and stepped back. "Try the arm technique you used on Tommy." Derek hesitated. He knew that move had worked because Tommy had been trying to be respectful and controlled. Chuck wouldn't give him that same opportunity, but Derek's pride made him try anyway. He lunged forward, attempting the same vicious arm grab that had broken Tommy's bone. What happened next was almost too fast for the crowd to follow. Chuck deflected Derek's grab with ease, spun him around, and had him pinned face down on the mat before Derek even knew what was happening. The whole sequence took maybe 3 seconds. Chuck applied just enough pressure to keep Derek immobilized, but not enough to cause injury. "This is what control looks like," he said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I could hurt you right now if I wanted to, but I don't want to, because that's not what martial arts is about." Derek struggled briefly, then realized the futility of it. He was completely helpless, at the mercy of someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. "Do you understand now?" Chuck asked, still maintaining the pin. "Real martial arts isn't about hurting people who can't defend themselves. It's about having the skill to protect people, including protecting them from bullies like you used to be." Chuck released the hold and stepped back, offering Derek a hand to help him up. Derek stared at the outstretched hand for a moment, then took it. As Derek got to his feet, something had changed in his expression. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame and confusion. "I'm sorry," Derek said, and for the first time all day he sounded like he meant it. Chuck nodded. "That's a start. But you're apologizing to the wrong person?" Derek looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned on his face. "Tommy. I need to apologize to Tommy. And his family," Chuck added. "And everyone here who had to watch you turn their sport into something ugly." Derek turned to face the crowd, most of whom were still looking at him with anger and disgust. Taking a deep breath, he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I want to apologize to everyone here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "What I did to Tommy was wrong. It wasn't martial arts and it wasn't competition, it was just mean and stupid." Some people in the crowd nodded approvingly at this admission. Others still looked skeptical, wondering if this change of heart would last. Chuck wasn't finished with Derek's education. "Apologizing is important, but it's not enough. What are you going to do differently from now on?" Derek thought for a moment. "I need to learn what martial arts really means." "Not from him," he said, glancing at his instructor, "but from someone who actually understands it." Derek's instructor looked offended. "Now wait just a minute." "No," Derek interrupted, showing backbone for the first time in a positive way. "You taught me to hurt people and call it martial arts. That's not what I want to be anymore." Chuck smiled slightly, the first time his expression had softened all day. "That's good thinking, son. Real martial arts takes years to learn properly. Are you willing to start over?" Derek nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I want to do this right." Chuck pulled out his wallet and handed Derek a business card. "This is a friend of mine who runs a good school about 20 minutes from here. Tell him I sent you, and that you need to learn what martial arts really means." Derek took the card like it was made of gold. "Thank you, Mr. Norris. I won't let you down." "Don't worry about letting me down," Chuck replied. "Worry about becoming someone you can be proud of." Later that evening, Chuck drove to the hospital where Tommy was having his arm set in a cast. The teenager's eyes went wide when the famous martial artist walked into his room. "Mr. Norris, what are you doing here?" Chuck sat down in the chair next to Tommy's bed. "I wanted to check on you and to tell you something important." "What's that?" "What happened to you today wasn't your fault. and it wasn't real martial arts. You showed more honor and courage in that match than Derek showed in his entire 5 years of training. Tommy smiled weakly. It sure doesn't feel like it. That's because you understand what martial arts is really about, Chuck said. You went out there to compete with respect and skill. You got hurt because someone else didn't understand those values. But don't let his ignorance make you quit something you love. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. I won't quit, but maybe I'll train. Harder. Good, Chuck said, standing to leave. And Tommy, when your arm heals, you come find me. I think you've got the heart of a real martial artist. 6 months later, Tommy was back competing, stronger and more confident than ever. Derek had quit his old school and was starting over at the academy Chuck had recommended, learning discipline and respect along with technique. And Chuck Norris continued going to tournaments whenever he could, not for the fame or recognition, but because he understood that sometimes the most important lessons happen when you least expect them.